Jessica Baggen was born May 3, 1979, and lived with her parents in the small town of Sitka, Alaska. Sitka was a place known for having little to no crime. As a teenager, she enjoyed listening to Willie Nelson, loved to cook, she enjoyed going fishing with her family, and was always excited to participate in the Thanksgiving pie-making marathons. She planned to attend college in Arizona and pursue a career in photography. On her 17th birthday, May 3, 1996, she spent the evening celebrating with her sister and her friends at her sister's home off Sawmill Creek Road. Early the next morning, she decided to walk home, which was only about a mile away. Her parents woke the next morning to find that she never made it home, and her father then reported her missing to the Sitka Police Department. The local search and rescue team focused their efforts in the wooded area west of the Indian River, between the campus of Sheldon Jackson College and Sawmill Creek Road. They soon found a shirt later identified as the one Jessica was wearing when she was last seen alive. Then, Jessica's body was found beneath the trunk of a large fallen tree in the Sitka National Historic Park, about 70 feet off the bike path which paralleled Sawmill Creek Road. The rest of her clothing and belongings were also found in the immediate area. 9 days later, a local man named Richard Bingham confessed to her sexual assault and murder. He had been living in the harbor on a boat and employed as a janitor at Sheldon Jackson College and was a heavy drinker. Sadly, Bingham was a simple-minded man that was easily manipulated. One example of this was, one time Bingham had been told he had stolen a salmon from a fish processor where he worked, so he showed up with a replacement fish. The manager told him that he hadn't stolen a fish and to go home. When news of Jessica's death overwhelmed the town, a drinking buddy of Bingham's suggested to him that he may have had something to do with the killing because he often blacked out while drinking. Soon, he was at the police station telling the officers he was having disturbing dreams and flashbacks about the murder and asked if they could help him. Officers interrogated Bingham for several hours using the Reed technique, which is an aggressive method that has been criticized for its tendency to produce false confessions. His confession was allegedly coerced, and nothing he volunteered himself was accurate, but he was still arrested. It was determined months later that none of the physical evidence collected from the crime scene connected him to the actual crime. A psychologist testified that Bingham was vulnerable to suggestion and had intellectual deficiencies. He went to trial for Jessica's sexual assault and murder in early 1997 and was found not guilty on all charges. He then moved to Washington to avoid the residents of Sitka as they still believed he was the killer. The hunt then continued for Jessica's real killer, the man with the matching DNA. More than 100 potential suspects were cleared through DNA comparison, and the trail went cold. In September of 2018, the Alaska Cold Case Unit discussed utilizing a new forensic DNA procedure called genetic genealogy. After reviewing the DNA evidence in the case, it was determined that there was sufficient DNA from evidence collected from the original investigation to generate a profile of the suspect. The suspect's DNA was submitted to Parabon Nanolabs a few weeks later, and in 2019, a profile was developed and uploaded into public genealogy databases. By the end of the year, after months of genealogical research, a new suspect emerged by the name of Steve Branch. Investigators established that Branch lived in Sitka at the time of the murder. Also, it was learned that the same year as Jessica's murder, Branch had been investigated by the Sitka police for sexually assaulting another teenage girl. 2 months before Jessica was murdered, a worker at C-Mart, a local grocery, found a teenage coworker crying in the break room. When the coworker asked what was wrong, the 18-year-old girl said Steve Branch had raped her. He was indicted and arrested for the incident in June of 1996. Branch took the stand and cried, talking about the mistake he had made, but maintaining the encounter was consensual. After only a few hours, the jury decided to acquit him. Branch stayed in Sitka for 15 more years and then moved to Austin, Arkansas in 2010. In January 2020, the Alaska Cold Case Unit reached out to the Arkansas State Police for their assistance. For weeks, they attempted to obtain a discarded DNA sample from Branch, but were unsuccessful. A few months later, Sitka PD was able to obtain a discarded DNA sample from a relative of Branch. Kinship DNA analysis that was completed in May of 2020 determined Steve Branch was most likely the source of the suspect DNA found on Jessica's clothing and body. In early August, investigators from the Alaska Bureau of Investigation traveled to Arkansas. The investigators went to Branch's home to question him and obtain a DNA sample in order to positively confirm he was the source of the suspect DNA. But he denied any involvement in the case and refused to voluntarily provide a DNA sample. Investigators left the residence to apply for a search warrant to secure a DNA sample directly from him. However, approximately a half hour after the investigators left his home, he shot himself. After securing a search warrant, investigators collected Branch's DNA during his autopsy. On August 10, 2020, it was confirmed that Branch's DNA matched the suspect DNA found on Jessica and at the scene. With the help of several private citizens who voluntarily uploaded their DNA profiles into public genealogy databases and then authorized their profiles to be accessible to law enforcement, the genealogists were able to piece together a complex family tree that eventually exposed Branch as Jessica's killer. After 25 years, Jessica's case is finally closed, and while it might not be the justice she deserved, at least her family now has some closure. Darlene Depaula Krashoc was born August 22, 1966, in Maryland to Paul and Betty. At the age of 20, she was an Army specialist on active duty stationed at Fort Carson, Colorado, and assigned to the 73rd Maintenance Company as a mechanic doing vehicle wheel repairs. On March 27, 1987, 2 officers from the Colorado Springs Police Department found her body while on routine patrol about 5:20 a.m. behind the Korean Club restaurant in Colorado Springs, Colorado. An autopsy would determine the cause of death to be from strangulation. The night before, she had gone to a club called Shuffles with other soldiers where she spent the evening drinking and dancing. Her friends decided to leave her there, and she was last seen leaving the club between midnight and 1 a.m. with an unidentified man. Both Shuffles and the Korean Club restaurant have since closed down and were about a mile apart. Detectives determined from the condition of her body, as well as fresh tire impressions in the nearby snow, that she had been killed elsewhere and then her body dumped behind the restaurant. Police found DNA evidence on her body but couldn't find a match, and the case went cold. Since DNA testing was not available in 1986, the case was reopened in 2004 and 2011, and an unknown male DNA profile was found on several pieces of evidence. In 2017, the DNA was used to create 2 composite photos showing what the suspect could have possibly looked like at 25 years old and between 50 and 55 years old. Based on the genealogy information, the Criminal Investigation Command would hit on a name in the database, Michael White. White is a retired soldier who was stationed at Fort Carson at the time of her murder. Photos of White also matched the composite sketch, and on June 12, 2019, he was arrested for the murder of Darlene at his home in the 1500 block of East 131st Place in Thornton, Colorado. During his trial in June of 2021, he testified that he joined the Army in 1979 right after high school and was stationed in Fort Carson in 1986. White said while stationed in Colorado Springs, it was common for Fort Carson soldiers to visit the Korean Club restaurant and Shuffles to drink beer and dance with women. He said in 1987 he lived off base with his then wife Hilda. He denies murdering Darlene and claims to not know how his DNA got on her or the wire hanger used to strangle her. He did admit to drinking and partying a lot during that time at the bar Darlene was last seen at and the place where her body was found. He also admitted to dancing and going home with a lot of women, but said he did not remember Darlene or recognize her in the photos. On June 25, 2021, Michael White was sentenced to life in prison without parole for the torture, murder, and sexual assault of Darlene, and her parents were finally able to see their daughter receive justice after 34 long years.